So, we come to the end. In this final lecture, I'd like to do three basic things. Firstly, I'd like to review and summarize some of the critical themes from our first 35 lectures, our look at the long run of Africa's history. Second, I'd like to offer as sober an assessment as I can of Africa in the first decade of the 21st century. In fact, alternative scenarios, if you like, a sort of glass half full versus glass half empty kind of analysis. And thirdly, I'd like to offer you some profiles, some looks at real people, individual lives, persons who, in the recent past, have been making some very impressive contributions indeed. Okay, we started the course with geography, the way I start every course I do. Physically, Africa comprises a remarkable variety of physical and geographic environments. It can be an achingly beautiful place. If you stand at Victoria Falls or Mount Kilimanjaro, you can easily wonder if there's anything on earth to top this. But it has never been an easy place. Its soils are old, they are leached. They are, relative to some other parts of the world, weak. Its rainfall is limited. Its disease environment, partly because most of Africa lies in the tropics and receives year-round warmth, has been a dangerous one. We looked at the emergence of humankind in Africa, why Africa, from a variety of evidences, including fossil evidence, DNA evidence in more recent times, can be shown quite conclusively to be the cradle of humankind, the birthplace of humankind. The rest of the world, in a quite literal sense, was populated out of Africa. The fundamental things which make us human developed here and developed here first. It's worth just reading a line or two from a longer quotation I used from John Reeder in lecture number 4. He said that humans dominate the earth and have been to the moon. We see visions of the future in the mind's eye and turn them to reality with aptitudes and talents which evolution bestowed in Africa. People originally lived directly off the environment, extracted their livelihood directly from it as hunters and gatherers, as foragers, and transformed it, therefore, rather little. That changed dramatically, as perhaps the greatest revolution in all of human history, the revolution of agriculture, aided, abetted, reinforced in Africa by the revolution of the discovery and spread of iron use, changed Africa in numerous ways. Population increased. There was a much greater level of sedentary life, not just a village existence in a rural setting, but the emergence of Africa's first cities. African communities developed over centuries, distinctive social relations, religious systems, and political institutions. I've been at some pains to offer what I hope is a subtler understanding of ethnic identity, something that I find often misunderstood, in fact, often distorted in the case of Africa. I've examined its importance and its fluid nature at numerous junctures. We tried to develop an understanding of ethnic groups, of so-called tribes, if we insist on usage of that term, that are identities not set in stone, not rigidly bounded, which have always overlapped, which are not inevitably bound for conflict. There's just as much, in fact, for my money, far more evidence of ethnic tolerance, coexistence, as there is of conflict in Africa's history. I simply asserted that this is a subject that we cannot ignore, that it is on occasion a life and death matter, as in Rwanda in 1994. But it is a category, an analysis, a mode of analysis, which falls far short of explaining everything about Africa. We've looked at the emergence of major states, kingdoms, empires, the fundamental units of the African political past, and we've done that in many different settings. In West Africa, we looked at legendary places of West Africa's so-called Golden Age, the kingdoms of Ghana and Mali, which have lent their names to modern countries. We looked at Songhai. We looked at the legendary real place called Timbuktu, which played an important role in several of those kingdoms of the West African savanna. On the East African coast, we looked at a variation on the theme of state building, the emergence of Swahili city-states, that is, compact, commercially oriented cities, 30 or 40 of them spread going back at least 1,000, perhaps 2,000 years along that East African coast. We looked in southern Africa at another place which gave its name to a modern country. That was Great Zimbabwe, the greatest stone ruins in Africa south of the Nile Valley. We've seen that Africa's vaunted isolation has frequently been exaggerated. Quite early on, we see evidence of contact, perhaps especially commercial contact, for instance, across the Sahara and across the Indian Ocean. There was also religious contact. We tried to extract some of the fundamental principles of Africa's spiritual life in the indigenous religions found around the continent. But we looked over the long run at the impact of two of the world's great religions, Christianity and Islam, and emphasized that even though these have become major parts of contemporary Africa's scene, that there has always been a large element of syncretism, of the combination, of the hybridization, if you like, between these religions coming into Africa and much older spiritual ideas which are far from gone. Still, in terms of this question of isolation and the global context for Africa's history, we reach a turning point if we go back about 500 years ago. Of course, that's true for many parts of the world, not least the New World, the Americas. At that juncture, around the turn of the 16th century, symbolized probably still rather well by Columbus's voyage of 1492 and those undertaken thereafter, we begin to see that Western European powers drive a global mercantile capitalist system, a system wherein the pursuit of wealth is largely an enterprise driven by the effort to get things, and sometimes persons defined as things, take them elsewhere for resale in the expectation or calculation, not always realized, of profit. Now, an important sub-dynamic of this post-1500 world and its impact on Africa was, of course, the emergence of the so-called Atlantic system, and perhaps its single most important component, and that was the development of the Atlantic slave trade. West Africa's emergence as the primary source of enslaved persons to labor in the New World had profound implications for the history of three continents. It meant the loss of millions of persons from West Africa, either killed in the operation of the trade or exported, of course, across the Atlantic, where they were crucial in the transformation of the Americas. Another sub-dynamic of this world emerging about 500 years ago, we found at the other corner, the other end of the continent, in the origins of what today has emerged as one of the continent's most important countries, and that, of course, is the Republic of South Africa. South Africa has a colonial past stretching back to a very considerably earlier date than much of the rest of Africa, and we looked at that in the case of the Cape Colony. We've also emphasized at many places in this course the comparability between the histories of Southern Africa, especially South Africa, and the history of North America, especially the United States. Both of them saw indigenous populations faced with incursions by European colonial immigrants. Both of them saw histories of slavery. Both of them saw frontier histories. Both of them saw the emergence of rigid, legalized racial domination and white supremacy, called in the first half of the 20th century segregation. And both, of course, have seen the efforts to change that system. Now, eventually, Africa's relationship with Europe took another dramatic turn about 120 years back or so, with the so-called Scramble for Africa. The scramble represented, of course, the carving of the continent, which King Leopold at the time called this magnificent African cake, into several European empires. It was at that time, during the scramble for Africa, that the basic national units of today's Africa, today's African nations, the 50 or so countries on the continent, the borders of those countries were created at the time of the scramble. And it may be remarkable to say they are very much still with us. There is one and only one case of legal formalized border change in Africa since the scramble, and that was the creation of a separate Eritrea out of the country of Ethiopia. Economically, African territories in the colonial period were made dependent upon an export-import system. The name of the game became the export of a single, perhaps two or three commodities. I call them mono-economies, forged during the colonial system, symbolized in many respects by what was genuine investment in the infrastructure of railways, but leading invariably from the points of production of primary materials, crops out of the ground or minerals out of the earth, to the ports, and from those ports to the colonial mother countries and the world economic system. That export orientation, that mono-economy situation, that is still with us as well. Now, in some territories in colonial Africa, significant numbers of Europeans came not just as missionaries or merchants or governors or soldiers. They came intending to stay. They were settlers. And I've emphasized at many points the importance of the difference between settler and non-settler colonies. This has affected a number of things, most obviously the question of whether Africans, whatever else they lost in the colonial period, would in fact directly lose their land. Now, eventually, by the middle parts of the 20th century, with great energy, Africans all over the continent organized nationalist movements against the colonial powers. And eventually they gained independence. But here again, we see the crucial difference in timing and means of decolonization represented by the distinction between settler and non-settler colonies. To put it simply, in places where there had been little settlement, independence was likely to be achieved far more peacefully, and it was likely to come much earlier, in and around the year 1960, not a bad symbolic stopping off point. In settler colonies concentrated in the southern part of the continent, in Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, and certainly in South Africa, majority rule was likely to come later, and it was likely to come only after often very bloody wars of liberation. Well, with great hopes, with great expectations then, ordinary Africans all over the continent entered the independence period. And indeed, for a decade or so, there were some quite impressive gains in these newly minted nations. Gains in economic growth, in education, in health care. Eventually, however, that first taste of freedom turned sour, and by and large, the expectations were disappointed for reasons both internal and external. In the middle of the 1970s, the international economic climate, perhaps punctuated most dramatically by the so-called oil shocks, the sudden rises of prices of this critical ingredient of any modern economy. The international climate turned inhospitable, and everything economic in Africa contracted. Rulers, usually the same nationalists who had led the struggles to gain independence, responded by tightening their grips on power. They lack the resources anymore to simply reward or buy off, if you like, opposition, reward supporters and buy off opposition. All over the continent, one-party states, military coups, and it has to be said, a very high level of corruption became the order of the day. In numerous places, there were real shooting wars. Angola and Mozambique's independence from Portugal did not signal the end of warfare in those countries, and they entered on to often decades-long or more civil wars. Liberia, Sudan, the Eastern Congo, Sierra Leone. In one place at least, Rwanda, it was worse than that, and the emergence of a genuine genocide shocked Africa and the world. Eventually, however, Phoenix-like, at the end of the 1980s and into the early 1990s, there was a second wave. Africa's second democratization took place. And again, ordinary people as well as extraordinary people all over the continent forged what may be the basis for a new political dispensation. South Africa probably represented, of course, with its conversion from the rigors of white supremacy under apartheid into a democratically elected government in 1994, the most remarkable case of all. So where does that leave us in the 21st century's first decade? I stated at the outset of the course, and I'll say it again, I refuse to be, I will never be, Pollyanna or Pangloss. I can make a good case, I think, for a quite dismal African future. Where's the financial and social capital for genuine development going to come from? What is a realistic alternative to continued reliance on commodity exports? And what are the likely returns for those exports? Isn't Africa going to have to wait another epoch for its turn as China and India bloom into developed powers? As if this weren't enough, what about HIV/AIDS? What else is out there? Maybe just staying alive is going to be challenge enough. If I can wax scriptural on you, as one corrupt leader shall be removed, so shall another be visited upon us. It's almost too easy to find examples. A country like Zambia or Kenya, where the expulsion or rejection, if you like, of one leader raises again the hopes and expectations, often find that those are disappointed by the replacements. So all of this can indeed lead to a conclusion that the glass is not just half empty, it's draining. Now, as you've probably guessed, that's not where my heart is. But professors are supposed to use their heads, and I think that there's plenty of evidence to suggest the possibility of something, not perhaps so grand as an African Renaissance, the phrase popularized by South Africa's President Mbeki, but something like measurable progress. First of all, the ideas of fundamental political accountability and basic political freedoms. Freedom to speak, to write, to organize, have, I think, been entrenched. That doesn't mean that they are enjoyed without fetter everywhere, but the idea of insisting upon those, that those should be the norm, has, I think, been firmly established. In this sense, the democratic revival of the late 1980s and early 1990s, despite its setbacks, has made a lasting mark. There are virtually no one-party states or military regimes on the continent. That would have been a hard thing to imagine in 1985 or 1990. Now, this change in turn is the key to exposing corruption and bringing it to within tolerable limits. The idea of taking Africa's farmers, and maybe especially Africa's women farmers, its female farmers, seriously, has also gained ground. On it depends more than anything else Africa's long-range food security, a subject not to be taken lightly anywhere. In Uganda and Senegal, vigorous public education spearheaded by upfront public rules of presidents, of leaders, has made a real dent and in fact has rolled back, contained, and reversed even a calamity so widespread as HIV and AIDS. In 2005, agreement was finally reached with institutions like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, African Development Bank, institutions largely dominated by the richest countries of the world, often called the G8 or what have you. Arrangements were finally made for a substantial measure of debt restructuring and, in fact, debt relief and forgiveness for a dozen or more African nations. This is not something, obviously, that can happen every year, every 5 years, every 10 years. But it does represent a fresh start. These, after all, were debts that were incurred through decisions, poor decisions, made by people on both sides of the equation, in Africa and in the developed world, in a previous generation. And yet the burdens have saddled a continent where half the population is under 15. I can't promise that restructuring of debt is going to lead to a takeoff in Africa's prospect. But I can virtually guarantee that without it, you won't see that takeoff. In the digital age, a case like Ireland, another place where a lot of people referred to it as a basket case 10, 20 years ago, a place like Ireland where there's been substantial evidence in education for a new era, and I mean the digital age, has sparked a boom. Perhaps that will offer a model. What if such education were offered to Africa's young and often very enthusiastic learners? Okay, I would like to close then with some profiles, as I mentioned at the outset, of some real people. And I'm going to start with, I'm going to mention 4. I'm going to draw them from each corner of the continent, from West Africa, from Southern Africa, from East Africa. Persons whom I think do offer us an instance of hope. You probably have never heard of Hamilton Naki. I had not. Hamilton Naki died in May of 2005 in Cape Town, South Africa. He had grown up very near to where Nelson Mandela grew up, in the so-called Eastern Cape, Transkei region of that country. At the age of 14, he'd gone to Cape Town, where he got a job at the University of Cape Town, at first tending the grass around that elite and basically whites-only institution around the tennis courts. He eventually caught on at the medical school and began to assist some of the professors there in the care and the anesthetization of animals used for medical students to learn and to practice surgery. It was there that doctors began to observe his own skills, his ability to join tiny blood vessels with amazing delicacy and accuracy. He apparently would often quietly finish operations medical students had started. In 1967, Dr. Christian Barnard asked Hamilton Naki to assist him in the world's first heart transplant. This was illegal. It was illegal for a black South African to be in a whites-only hospital in an operating theater, but it was done anyway, and he was apparently a critical part of that dramatic achievement. As Barnard said in an interview in 1993, he has skills I don't have. If Hamilton had had the opportunity to perform, he would probably have become a brilliant surgeon. In 2003, he finally received an honorary medical degree from the University of Cape Town. Well, somebody who did become a doctor, although a doctor of history, not of medicine, was someone from the other part of the continent, Emmanuel Akyompong from Ghana. He was born in Kumasi, the historic home of the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana. Eventually went overseas to the United States and earned a doctorate in African history. His brilliance, in fact, has catapulted him to a position as professor of history at none other than Harvard University. You might be sitting here thinking that, well, Akyompong's another example of another of Africa's problems, brain drain. Not so fast. He has maintained his home in Ghana. In fact, his wife and 7-year-old daughter are there. He's got one of the world's longer commuting marriages. And he's become the voluntary U.S. president of something called the African Public Broadcasting Foundation. The idea here is to offer a continent-wide service which would parallel the roles played by NPR and PBS, that is, independent sources of information, news, and so forth across the continent. And the first project which Akyompong intends to tackle is the possibility of combining AIDS education messages with information and entertainment through such a network. As he puts it, Africa is ready to step forward. Let's return to East Africa, southeastern Africa, to the country of Mozambique. A young man not yet 30 years old, Eric Cheras. He left Mozambique in the midst of its civil war and got a degree at the University of Cape Town in electrical engineering, but returned. Eric is an employee at a nonprofit organization which has a disarmingly simple solution to a basic human health problem. There are 3 million children who die each year of vaccine-preventable diseases. But vaccines generally need to be kept cold. They need to be kept at 46 degrees Fahrenheit or less. What Cheras has done with his fellow employees at the organization he works for, called Village Reach, is to take propane-driven refrigerators to various clinics and villages in Mozambique's rural areas, where, therefore, the vaccines can be stored safely, they will not go bad, and where children can begin to be inoculated against preventable diseases like diphtheria, hepatitis B, and so on. My final example is a remarkable woman indeed. Her name is Wangari Maathai. She was born in 1940 in central Kenya. That means that she grew up during the Mau Mau emergency that we looked at in a previous lecture. She came to the United States around the time of Kenya's independence in 1963 and got bachelor's and master's degrees in this country. In 1971, from the University of Nairobi, Wangari Maathai became the first East African woman from any country in that region to obtain a PhD, in this case in veterinary anatomy. By the mid-70s, she had begun working with women's movements in Kenya and looking at the needs of rural Kenyan women, the lack of firewood, the lack of clean drinking water. And she related this to the spread of commercial plantations she had seen since she was a youth, which destroyed the biodiversity and capacity of forests to conserve water. She started the Green Belt movement, and the Green Belt movement since that time has planted on the order of 30 million trees on farms, schoolyards, churchyards, all through the East African country of Kenya. Her efforts often led her to clashes with commercial interests, the owners of plantations, and with the former despotic regime of President Daniel Arap Moi. She was denounced and persecuted, but persevered. She was part of the demand for democratic reform, which eventually led to Moi's departure in 2002 and multi-party elections. She was elected to Parliament with 98% of the vote in December 2002 and is now the Assistant Minister for Environment, Natural Resources, and Wildlife. She's spoken out on the disproportionate burden of women with HIV/AIDS and against age-old cultures, age-old traditions even of her own culture, such as female genital mutilation or female circumcision. For her efforts, Wangari Maathai in 2004 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And I would like to close by reading a little bit from her acceptance speech. She noted that historically her people had been persuaded to believe that because they're poor, they lack not only capital but the knowledge to address their challenges. But in this simple process of planting trees, they discovered they must be part of the solutions. She addressed her fellow Africans at the end and said, as we embrace this recognition, let's use it to intensify our commitment to our people, to reduce conflicts and poverty and thereby improve their quality of life. Let us embrace democratic governments, protect democratic rights, and protect our environment. I am confident that we shall rise to the occasion. I have always believed that solutions to most of our problems must come from us. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the journey, and I leave you with this. 30 years ago, I went to Africa and got hooked on its reality and its history. I know that many of you have either taken or contemplated such a journey. If you're still contemplating it, I leave you with one simple word: go. Thank you and goodbye.